She saw the old veteran standing there, cane trembling under the weight of tired legs. Could one small act change her life? She saw the way no one else seemed to notice the quiet strain in his eyes, and without a second thought, she gave up her seat, a small gesture she thought would be forgotten by morning. She didn't know that weeks later, an envelope would arrive, carrying more than just words, that the veteran she helped would reach back across the years to lift her up in return, that her small kindness would echo in ways she never imagined. This is the story of how one simple chair became a bridge, how a quiet choice to stand for someone else can ripple out like a quiet tide and change not just a moment but a life. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning air in Millfield, Ohio carried the cold bite of winter inside the small General Health clinic that chill had followed people in, clinging to the folds of jackets and scarves. The waiting room was warm enough, but the smell of antiseptic lingered, clean, clinical and a little sharp. Grace Parker sat on one of the hard plastic chairs lining the wall. She held her checkup slip in her gloved hands, shifting it from one palm to the other as she waited. Her eyes were tired from a long morning at the bakery, and the sweet scent of cinnamon still clung faintly to her sleeves. Around her, voices murmured softly. The overhead speaker called out numbers in an even, patient tone. A baby fussed in the corner while an elderly couple quietly read a tattered magazine together. Grace's gaze drifted to the large window near the entrance where the world outside was wrapped in gray clouds and the promise of snow. She felt that slow ache of fatigue in her shoulders, the kind that settles in after days of early mornings and late nights, but she still wore that small polite smile, the one she kept for strangers. No matter how tired she felt, when the door opened again, she didn't think much of it at first. It was just another patient, another routine appointment. But then she saw the man who walked in, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He was tall, though age had bent his frame slightly. The battered winter coat hung on his narrow shoulders, and the pale light from outside caught the silver in his hair. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room slowly. Grace noticed how his hand gripped the cane just a little too tightly, how his steps, measured and careful, seemed to cost him more effort than they should. She saw too the way his eyes, clear and steady, took in the room with quiet acceptance. There were no empty seats left. She felt a pang in her chest as he shifted his weight uncomfortably, the strain in his leg making him wince. Without a second thought, she stood up and gestured to her chair. Please, she said softly. He blinked, surprised by her offer, then he gave a small, grateful nod and lowered himself into the seat with care. For a moment, the room seemed to exhale a simple, small act of kindness that most wouldn't notice, but Grace felt it in her chest, like a little spark of warmth against the cold air. She stepped back and leaned against the wall, content to stand and wait. The old man looked up at her, his face etched with the lines of long years and quiet battles. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice calm, but touched with something deeper. He shifted on the seat, adjusting his cane. The wait can be long here. Grace just smiled and shrugged lightly. I'm all right, she replied. You look like you needed it more than me. He chuckled softly, a low sound that seemed to carry memories in its tone. You work around here? He asked, glancing at the smudge of flour still clinging to her sleeve. Grace nodded. I work at the bakery down the street, she said. Early mornings, but it's good work. Just stopped in for a routine checkup, he hummed, his eyes softening with understanding. Early mornings and late nights, he murmured. I remember those days. He paused, then smiled. You're a good soul. Most people wouldn't bother to look up, let alone stand up. Grace felt her cheeks flush slightly. She looked away, embarrassed by the compliment, but warmed by it. Could this small kindness lead to something extraordinary? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The overhead speaker called out another number, and a nurse appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. Grace held her breath for a moment, waiting for her own number to be called, but when it was, she stepped forward, then paused. She turned back to the old man, holding out her appointment slip. Here, she said quietly, you take my number. Go in first. He looked up, startled by her insistence. Are you sure? He asked. Grace just nodded. I'm not in a rush, she said softly. You should go ahead. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just watched her, those clear, unwavering eyes searching her face. Then he reached out and took the slip from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a warmth that spoke more than words ever could. Thank you, he said simply. There was no flourish in his voice, no need for elaborate gratitude, just two words, heavy with meaning. Grace stepped back and watched as he rose slowly, cane tapping gently against the linoleum floor. She saw the way he squared his shoulders, even as his leg trembled with each step. She saw too the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, as if every step was a choice to keep going. As he disappeared into the examination hallway, Grace let out a small sigh. She didn't know his name or his story, but she knew she would remember the way he looked at her, like he saw something worth holding on to in that crowded waiting room with its antiseptic air and flickering lights. Something quiet and good had passed between them. She leaned back against the wall, her hands tucked in her coat pockets. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to the bakery, to her mother waiting at home, to the steady rhythm of a life built on early mornings and small kindnesses. And though her feet ached and her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, she felt strangely light, as if standing up for someone else had eased the weight she carried alone. The nurse's voice called out another number, and the shuffle of bodies shifted again, but Grace stood still, a small smile at the corner of her lips, feeling the warmth of that brief, wordless connection echo in her heart. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall in soft, lazy flakes, blanketing the world in a quiet white. She watched it for a moment, breathing in the hush of winter, and in that simple, unremarkable morning, she felt just for a heartbeat that the world was a softer place than she'd feared, all because of a seat, a smile, and the simple kindness of letting someone else rest. Grace found another seat farther down the hallway. Sinking into the hard plastic chair with a quiet exhale, she felt the cold of the seat through her coat and tried to settle her breathing. It wasn't exhaustion exactly, but the weight of so many long days stacked one on top of the other. She thought back to the moment she'd stood up, offering that chair. Without hesitation, just a small thing, really, something anyone might have done, but sitting there now, she felt a glow in her chest she couldn't quite explain. It was more than just the relief of giving, it was a memory, a flicker of her father's face, the way he'd always insisted on holding the door for strangers. Even when his own hands were full, she realized she'd carried that lesson forward without even knowing. Grace watched the line of patients shifting in the corridor, some checking their watches, others scrolling idly on their phones. She wondered if any of them had noticed the old man's hesitation at the door, the strain in his leg as he balanced on that cane. She doubted it. The world moved too fast, most days. She tucked her hair behind her ear, feeling a rush of quiet pride. It didn't matter if no one else had seen, she knew she had done the right thing. A small part of her worried she'd broken some unwritten rule, giving up her appointment slot so freely, but another part, deeper and stronger, told her it was worth it. Sometimes the smallest gesture could ripple out farther than anyone imagined. She shifted in her seat and looked down at her hands, roughened by long hours at the bakery. The flour never quite washed away, it settled into the lines of her palms like a quiet badge of who she was. She smiled faintly, remembering the warmth of the oven and the laughter of the early morning crew. Meanwhile, farther down the hallway, John Mitchell sat with the slip of paper still clutched in his hand. His fingers ran absently along the handle of his cane, worn smooth by years of use. He looked straight ahead, but his mind was already turning over the brief exchange he'd just shared with the young woman. The light in her eyes, the way she had offered the seat without a second's hesitation, it stirred something in him. He let out a slow breath, feeling a pang of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope maybe, or just the simple recognition that kindness still had a place in the world. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. Its screen small and scuffed. He tapped out a short message with deliberate care, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble, despite the stiffness of old age. Met a kind girl today. We'll find out more tonight. He pressed send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, letting his hand rest on the head of the cane once more. No one around him paid any mind. He was just another old man in a crowded clinic, but inside, his thoughts were alive with purpose. John Mitchell had long since left behind the life where every decision felt like it might change the course of a mission. In those days, he had commanded rooms and signed orders that shifted more than lives, they shaped entire futures. But now in this small town, he had found a new mission. He watched the hallway with calm eyes, taking in the restless fidgeting of those around him. He saw Grace across the way, her shoulders hunched slightly, but her face calm and focused, and in that steady posture, he recognized something he had seen in the best soldiers he'd ever known. Not bravado, not showy heroism, just quiet courage worn like a second skin, the kind of spirit that didn't ask for notice, that simply did what was right and moved on. He let his thoughts drift for a moment, remembering nights in distant lands when everything depended on the smallest choice, when a word, a gesture, could mean the difference between survival and silence. And he realized that Grace in her simple act had shown that same instinct to protect, to honor, even if no one was watching. He thought to himself, she doesn't even know the weight of what she did. The memory of her small smile, how it didn't falter, even as she stood in that cold hallway, made his chest tighten, and in that tightening, he felt the echo of his own purpose returning, a whisper that said he still had something left to give. He shifted on the chair, the ache in his leg, a familiar companion. He didn't mind it, the ache was part of the life he'd chosen, and he had never wished it away. Instead, he let it remind him of the strength still humming quietly in his bones. Across the room, Grace looked up and caught his gaze just for a moment. She offered him another small smile, one she didn't even realize she wore, and in that glance, he saw everything he needed to know. When the nurse finally called his name, he rose slowly, steadying himself with the cane. Each step was measured and careful, but there was no hint of apology in his posture. He moved like a man who had learned long ago that dignity was not in speed, but in intention. Before he disappeared down the hallway, he paused at the reception desk. He leaned in and spoke softly to the clerk, his voice low and firm. Could I get the young lady's name, please? He asked. I'd like to send a proper thank you. The clerk barely looked up. Used to small requests and quiet questions, she jotted something down on a slip of paper and handed it to him without a second thought. John took it with a polite nod, Folding it carefully and slipping it into his pocket, no one noticed the small exchange, no one paid much attention to an old man's quiet gratitude, but he stood a little taller as he turned away, the weight of the paper light in his hand to him. It wasn't just a name, it was a thread, a promise he intended to keep. As he walked slowly down the hall, the cane tapping softly at his side, John Mitchell felt something shift inside him, not a dramatic surge, not a battle cry, just a quiet affirmation that even in the smallest choices, there was room to honor the life he had once lived and the life he saw in the kind eyes of a young woman who didn't even know she'd made a difference. He knew as he moved through the sterile corridors of that clinic that he would remember her face, not just for her kindness, but for the way she reminded him of what he had always believed, that even when the world moved too fast, there would always be people willing to slow down long enough to stand for someone else. When he finally stepped out into the cold afternoon air, he let the wind bite at his cheeks, he leaned on his cane and took one long breath, filling his lungs with the sharp, clean air, and with that breath, he carried forward a quiet promise that kindness would never be forgotten. No matter how many winters had come and gone, a few weeks passed, and the memory of that morning at the clinic slowly faded into the rhythm of Grace's daily life. The bakery opened before sunrise, and she was there before the first light touched the sleepy town of Millfield. She worked quietly, her hands moving with practiced precision, kneading dough, dusting flour, and greeting customers with a soft smile that never asked for anything in return. The days were long but familiar, each one blending into the next. Grace found comfort in that routine, the steady heartbeat of the ovens and the warm smell of bread rising in the early hours. She told herself she didn't need anything more, that kindness was its own reward, enough to keep her going. Then one afternoon, as she wiped down the glass counter and watched the last customer leave, she noticed a small envelope lying near the register. It wasn't from the bakery suppliers or an overdue bill. It was plain, unmarked except for her name written in a careful, steady hand. She picked it up and turned it over, her fingers trembling just a little. Inside was a letter, folded once, the paper thick and crisp. She unfolded it slowly, and as she read, her breath caught in her throat. Miss Parker, it began, each word precise, each stroke of the pen deliberate. That morning, you gave up your seat for an old soldier. It was more than just a chair. It was a gesture that spoke of trust. She paused, her eyes wide, feeling the truth of those words sink deep into her chest. The letter continued, simple but resolute. Please allow us to repay the trust. Enclosed is a small token of gratitude and an invitation to a program that supports families who give so much of themselves. This opportunity comes to you through the recommendation of John Mitchell. Grace's fingers tightened around the paper, her pulse quickening as she read his name. She could barely believe it. One moment of kindness, a single morning she'd almost forgotten, and here it was, returning to her like a quiet echo in the hush of the bakery. She blinked back tears, her throat tight with something she couldn't quite name. In the envelope was a check, the numbers neat and clear, enough to cover her mother's medicine for a few months. Alongside it was a simple card, an invitation to a support program that offered not just financial help, but community resources and a way forward. For a long moment, she just stood there, the letter pressed to her chest. The clatter of pans in the back room faded, the smell of yeast and cinnamon no longer mattered. All she could think of was the quiet dignity of that old man, his gentle eyes, and the steady way he'd thanked her. Grace felt a flush of warmth in her cheeks. She hadn't expected any of this, she hadn't done what she did for reward or recognition, but the letter was clear. This was more than thanks, it was an invitation to hope, to possibility, to a future she hadn't dared to imagine. And in that invitation, she felt the first fragile threads of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Security. She sat down behind the counter, the wooden stool cool beneath her, and read the letter again. Each word felt like a balm, a gentle reminder that sometimes the smallest acts could be the ones that mattered most. A seat, a smile, a quiet moment of understanding. They had opened a door she never knew was there. As she read, she couldn't help but think of John Mitchell. His face came back to her in memory, lined and weathered, but calm, steady, unbreakable. She realized she had seen something that day, in the quiet way he moved and the kindness in his eyes. She let her mind drift, and in that drifting, the memory of his past slipped in like a soft current. She saw him in uniform, though she'd never known it then, the sharp crease of dress blues, the weight of medals that never seemed to matter to him as much as the men beside him. He had led teams through the shadows of conflict, always choosing silence over glory, service over self. In that flicker of memory, she understood why he'd reached back to help her, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, unspoken code to protect those who carried kindness in their hearts, to stand for them the way he had stood for so many long before the world had moved on. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting that understanding wash over her. She could almost hear his voice, steady and calm. Some debts can't be repaid with money, they're repaid with care. She opened her eyes again, feeling the truth of those words settle in her bones. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope like a treasure. This wasn't about charity, she realized, this was about connection, the quiet threads that ran between strangers, binding them together in small, unseen ways. The bakery felt different when she stood up, the hum of the refrigerators, the faint tick of the old clock above the door, they all seemed softer, somehow. She felt lighter, as if the world had shifted just a little, making room for this unexpected grace. She looked out the window at the snowy street, the cars moving slow and careful along the slick roads. Somewhere out there, she knew John Mitchell was walking, maybe with that same steady cane, maybe with a quiet smile, and she knew she would carry that memory with her as bright and steady as the morning light. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling the weight of the envelope there, the promise it carried. She wasn't just a baker anymore, she thought with a small private smile. She was someone who had been seen, who had been trusted, all because of one simple seat. And as the last light of day slipped through the bakery windows, Grace whispered a quiet thank you, not to the letter, not to the check, but to the man who had reminded her that even the smallest kindness could echo far beyond what she could see. And in that whisper, she felt the warmth of belonging, soft and steady in the quiet of the evening. The bell over the door chimed as the last customer of the day stepped inside, and she greeted them with that same gentle smile, a smile that knew deep down that a single moment of kindness could change the course of a life, and hers, she knew, had just begun to change. The weeks that followed moved like a gentle tide, each day carrying Grace forward into something new. The program she'd been invited to turned out to be more than she'd expected, a place where people shared not just resources but stories. She attended classes that taught practical skills from budgeting to caregiving, and she listened to others who, like her, had learned that even the smallest kindness could open doors they never saw coming. At home, the changes were quiet but steady. Her mother's health stabilized with the new medicine, and the relief in her eyes made every early morning shift feel easier. Grace felt her own shoulders relax for the first time in years, the weight of worry lifting just a little more each day. The bakery noticed too. Word of what she'd done, of the letter she'd received, spread in that slow, careful way news travels in small towns. Regulars started showing up more often, lingering over coffee and warm bread, their smiles soft and knowing. Grace never let it go to her head. She kept her hands busy, her voice gentle, the same as always, but there was a quiet pride in her chest now, not boastful, just a steady glow she carried like a secret. One evening, long after the bakery had closed and the streets had grown still, she found herself walking through the park near her home. The sun hung low, painting the lake in soft streaks of golden pink. The air smelled of pine and the last warmth of the day, and she felt the peace of it settle into her bones. As she walked along the path, her eyes fell on a familiar figure. John Mitchell sat on one of the worn wooden benches by the water, his cane resting against his knee. He looked out over the lake, the setting sun catching the silver in his hair, his expression calm and reflective. Grace slowed her steps and then stopped, her breath caught somewhere between surprise and recognition. She took a moment just to watch him, to take in the quiet dignity of the man who had reminded her what kindness could mean. Then she walked forward, her feet steady on the gravel path. When she reached him, she offered a small smile and said, "Evening, Mr. Mitchell." He turned his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Evening, Grace," he said, his voice as soft and sure as she remembered. She sat down beside him, their shoulders almost touching on the narrow bench. For a few breaths, they said nothing, just watched the water ripple and the light fade. It was enough, the quiet between them as natural as the slow turn of the seasons. Finally, John spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know, Grace," he said, "you did something that day most people wouldn't even think twice about." He paused as if searching for the right words. "You stood up when you didn't have to," he continued. "No uniform, no rank, just a simple choice to see someone else." She felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. "I just did what anyone would do," she said softly. "It wasn't anything special." He turned to look at her, his eyes gentle but unflinching. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "You did exactly what this world needs more of. Quiet kindness given without a second thought." She breathed in the evening air, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. "I've spent most of my life believing that real honor isn't in medals or ceremonies," he said, his gaze returning to the lake. "It's in the small things, the ways we choose to show up for each other, even when no one's watching." Grace nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm no hero, Mr. Mitchell," she said after a moment, her voice soft, but sure. He smiled then. A real smile, warm and a little sad. "No," he agreed, "but you're someone who understands what matters. That's more than enough." The light on the water turned from gold to amber, the last of the sun slipping behind the hills. They sat together in that hush, the world around them slowing to a gentle pause. Grace let herself lean into that quiet, the weight of the past few months dissolving in the softness of the moment. She thought of the programs she'd joined, of the new faces she'd met, and the small ways they'd lifted each other up. She thought of her mother's laughter in the kitchen that morning, bright and clear, and she thought of the letter that had started it all, of how a single seat in a crowded clinic had become the beginning of something she never saw coming. John shifted beside her, his cane tapping once against the bench. He looked at her again, his eyes steady and kind. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to believe that the only way to serve was on the battlefield in uniform with orders to follow." He paused and she felt the weight of his memory in the stillness. "But I've come to See that there's another kind of service, he said, the kind that doesn't need a rank. The kind that lives in how we treat the people right in front of us. Grace smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips. I only gave up a chair, Mr. Mitchell, she said gently. He chuckled, a deep, warm sound that rumbled in his chest, and that, he said, was everything. The last light of day stretched across the water, turning it to liquid gold. A hush fell over the park, and for a moment, the world felt held in the gentle hands of evening. Grace closed her eyes and breathed it in, feeling the peace of it settle like a promise. When she opened her eyes again, John was still there beside her, his presence quiet and steady. She knew this was the end of one story, but not the end of the kindness that had started it, and she knew, too, that no matter how many winters came and went, there would always be room for small acts of grace. The world around them grew softer, the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. She felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest, a belief that kindness never really ends, it just finds new places to bloom. And in that stillness, she whispered a simple, grateful word. Thank you, she said, not just to the man beside her, but to the world that had shown her how much a single seat could hold. And as the darkness deepened and the night grew still, Grace Parker knew that her story and his would carry on in ways neither of them could yet see. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.